Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I have a quick question for you. In light of the recent events, I want to hear your thoughts. How do you think toxic polarization is fueling political violence in our society today? It's super easy to share your perspective. Just scroll down in the show notes and click on the Send Us a Text Message link. You can do it right from inside your podcast player, whether you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other app. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Now, let's start the show. Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 43. Imagine this, you're walking down the street and see someone wearing a political button, t-shirt, or hat you disagree with. Instantly, your guard goes up, you make assumptions about their beliefs, their values, maybe even their character. Sound familiar? In today's political climate, it seems we've reached a point where we judge people based on their affiliation, not their words. This snap judgment, assuming someone's our enemy before they even speak, is fueling a dangerous level of polarization. It makes compromise impossible and drowns out civil discourse and ultimately hinders progress on critical issues. But is there a way to break free from these snap judgments and start listening to each other again? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're joined by a leading researcher in social psychology who's been studying the phenomenon of ideological inferences. Carsten Sander is a PhD student in social psychology at University of Hamburg. His work explores how we automatically assign political labels to people based on their behavior. His research is shedding light on why we fall victim to these snap judgments, and more importantly, how we can overcome them and start having meaningful conversations across the political divide. So if you're tired of the constant outrage and want to learn how to better understand and deal with these emotions, then you don't want to miss this episode. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for making time to come on the show. Carsten Sander, is that fairly close to the right pronunciation? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting paper, and from a sort of real life perspective, I sort of observe this kind of behavior. Talking about this idea of these ideological inferences, you sort of observe this behavior in others, and sometimes even in yourself. So, and I think what. Again, the sort of specific, sort of technical descriptions that you're using seem to also pretty much, apply to what we see in the real world as well. This idea that people make these inferences based on behavior, and we draw these ideological inferences, and the it's interesting to me the idea that these are spontaneous. So I guess first, maybe just tell us a little bit about what you're talking about with how people draw these ideological inferences from behavior, particularly around partisanship. And you also talk about beyond just partisanship, but like other things like feminist and racist and homophobe and things like that as well. And sort of tell us a little bit about that process. And then I want to talk a little bit about sort of the spontaneous, if I can pronounce my own English, my own native language, spontaneous aspect of it. And I want to drill down on that a little bit as well. But yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, okay. As you've said, these inferences are something that everyone seems to know from just everyday life, right? When I posted about the paper on X, formerly Twitter, someone even wrote, like, you don't need research for this, just debate politics on Twitter and then you know it. But yeah, sometimes we, as psychologists, we have to work hard to prove kind of obvious things, you might say. And yeah, so what we were interested in was whether these ideological inferences, as we call them, are spontaneous, as you said. because usually, like a lot of research investigating impression formation, they would just like present someone with a statement, for example, like something that implies conservative, for example, and then asked the participants, do you think this person is a conservative? And of course, in this case, we don't know whether this is like something that would have happened spontaneously in real life, right? So what we did was we used kind of indirect methods from the literature on impression formation that don't directly ask participants for their impressions, but instead we present them with these kind of ideology implying behaviors or opinions, and then we show them a word and ask them whether that word was part of the description or not. And that word is either the implied category, like conservative, for example, or a category that is implied in another statement. And then, participants have to just indicate whether this word was part of the statement or not. And if they spontaneously inferred the category while reading the statement or the description, then they get just a tiny bit, or it gets a tiny bit more difficult for them to correctly indicate that it was not part of the statement. And because it gets more difficult, they need a little bit more time. And from this slowing down of responses, we know that they did in fact infer the categories from the descriptions. And because we didn't ask them about their impressions, we just told them to read and memorize the descriptions, we can say that these inferences are spontaneous.
And we shouldn't confuse that with sort of automatic, or maybe we should. Maybe tell us sort of the differences there.
That's a really tricky thing, because automaticity is like a huge concept in psychology. Like you can divide it up into multiple different components. So something can be considered like fully automatic if it happens without intention, subconsciously, effortlessly, that is like you don't have to spend any cognitive resources on it, and uncontrollably. So it also happens when you try to kind of suppress it. And from our research, we can only say that these inferences happened without intention, because participants were not supposed to form impressions. They were merely asked to memorize the materials. But we know from like research on spontaneous trait inferences, so like inferences of personality traits like extroverted, for example, that these kinds of inferences can also happen like sort of subconsciously, and that they're really difficult to suppress. So maybe they're also, to some degree, like efficient and effortless. But for the ideological inferences, we haven't demonstrated that. We can only assume that it is similar to inferences of personality traits.
Yeah, so I want to say in some cases, I believe if I understand, if I remember from the paper, there was also situations where it was sort of an active, conscious effort where you sort of asked them to make inferences, right? And we saw what that's like, or no?
Yeah, that's true. We had like a mix of different methods. Some of them were these more subtle methods I described in the beginning, but then we also had this kind of standard direct question about their impressions.
Yeah. Okay, so it can be. I guess it can be both. Is kind of what we're saying, or we don't know for sure if it sort of leans in the automatic direction, but it sounds like it might.
Well, we can say for sure that the inferences happen spontaneously. That we don't have to like ask participants to form impressions. They also do it if we don't ask them, but we don't know whether like we can consider them fully automatic, because that's such a like big concept,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess going down, I wanted to go down a little bit of a terminology situation that I found in the paper, that this concept of diagnosticity, And I wonder if that can be described in a sort of plain language enough way that I can understand it better, and maybe the listeners as well. But for me, actually, this is sort of maybe just a selfish question because I wanted to understand it better after reading the paper.
Yeah. Diagnosticity is like a really fancy word for a relatively simple idea, I would say. So maybe you could just rephrase it as like how predictive something is of something. So we say a behavior is diagnostic of a category when the behavior predicts category membership. So, for example, I think in the US, most Republicans are like tend to be pro-life, and most Democrats tend to be pro-choice, right? So the fact of like being pro-life is diagnostic of being Republican.
And it has, if I understand, one reason I brought it up is because it has some implications, as I understand it, sort of with connection back to sort of accuracy and sort of and therefore some implications to sort of this affective polarization we find ourselves in.
Yeah, so you can ask the question, like, we think that people make these inferences because they perceive a lot of behaviors to be diagnostic of different categories. And now you can ask the question, why is that? Why do people perceive diagnosticity to be high? And there's basically two broad answers to the question. The first is, well, diagnosticity might actually be high. And the second one is they might overestimate diagnosticity of behaviors. And there's actually, like for the US, there's evidence for both of these reasons. With regards to actual diagnosticity, you could look at the literature on like partisan sorting and opinion alignment, which basically says that like over the last decades, people in the US have become like more ideologically sorted, right? So in the Republican Party didn't used to be fully conservative, like those dimensions were rather cross-cutting. But over the last decades, conservatives sorted into the Republican Party, liberals sorted into the Democrat Party. So like ideology becomes more diagnostic of partisanship. And that's not just the case with ideology, it's also the case with religion and social class, probably racialized group membership. So these cues become more diagnostic of partisanship. And then also within the broad concept of ideology, opinions seem to be becoming more clustered, right? So like having one liberal opinion becomes more predictive of having another liberal opinion, for example. So these are indicators of actual diagnosticity increasing over the years. But we also know that like this process is far from complete. So there's also a lot of opinions that are kind of counter stereotypic, so to say. And people seem to overestimate the differences between the different parties, for example. So I think there's this really kind of hilarious finding that I think Americans on average think that like 30% of Democrats are LGBT, and 1/3 of Republicans earn more than $250,000 a year, which both are like really gross overestimates. And this indicates that, we overestimate the differences, and that implies that we also overestimate diagnosticity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's sort of spirals into this and basically just getting it wrong. Because we carry that into these other implications. So, so one thing that I think was particularly interesting I wanted to talk about is that this idea that what you're finding that even and you introduced this with some prior research, but this finding that even if people were given like there was another reason for this behavior that wasn't necessarily this ideological, shouldn't imply this ideological category, people still did it, so that seems to also back up some research that has happened in other categories or for other subjects like this. So let's maybe talk about that a little bit. That seems to give it this idea. You use the term robustness.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of research on the so-called correspondence bias. That's like the more technical term we use in the paper. But this is mostly from the domain of just personality traits, not with like ideological content. But yeah, that research has shown that people often seem to neglect situational explanations of behaviors and always default to inferring some stable disposition, like a personality trait or some other kind of category about the person they observe or perceive. Yeah, so to investigate this, we took our behavioral descriptions that implied the categories, and then we had to come up with like alternative explanations for these behaviors. And I think this was probably the hardest part of my PhD, because we had some relatively extreme behaviors implying also relatively extreme categories, like Nazi, for example. And now, try to come up with a reason for behavior that makes people think that's Nazi. That's really difficult. But we managed to find a few explanations for some behaviors that other participants rated as good explanations. And then we presented them together with our behavioral descriptions. And based on the literature about the correspondence bias, like these studies showing that people often neglect these alternative explanations, we were expecting them to not have a big effect, but they turned out to have like almost no effect whatsoever. And this is definitely something that surprised us. But there's a few different explanations that might illuminate this finding. And I think the most important one is what we already talked about, this concept of diagnosticity. Because when people perceive a specific behavior to be really diagnostic of a category, then it probably doesn't matter if there's another potential explanation, because if only a Republican would be pro-life, then it doesn't matter what his reasons are. He has to be a Republican, right? So this is one plausible explanation. The other one is something that we didn't actually put in the paper, but that I've been thinking a bit more about recently, that there might be like different kinds of categorization. One that is rather predictive, like you categorize someone trying to predict their future behavior, trying to predict what other opinions they have. But there's also such a thing as moral categorization, right? And moral categorization should also be relatively independent of whether we think there are specific reasons for behavior, because we perceive something as immoral if we perceive it to be harmful to some group of people or some value that we have. So that might be a different explanation of this remarkable robustness of these inferences, that some of them are just moral inferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by that aspect of it. So I know the paper doesn't talk a lot about specific interventions, and says further research needs to be done on that. But I'm curious if you've had any thoughts, or from what you've learned from this research, whether you had any ideas that just sort of didn't make it into the paper, but it maybe, or even after the paper, like how can we? I mean, it seems like a lot of the things around this affective polarization can be reduced somewhat by clearing up these misperceptions. In fact, you even a couple times have talked about sort of pro-life being a diagnostic for Republican or Democrat. And your paper even talks about how that's a little bit of a misperception because it's not as diagnostic as
Yeah.
people think it is, right? So even seems like lowering the perceptions is kind of one. But I didn't know if you had any other, sort of ideas or interventions for this. How can we stop ourselves from being ourselves?
Yeah, well, I think this is actually the most important thing we can do, probably, to make people with like non-traditional or like counter-stereotypic opinions more visible. And I think often, at least on social media, I think people who have kind of deviant opinions, like a liberal or someone in a liberal Twitter or X network that has some opinion that is considered really conservative by others, they will probably not talk about it as much because they fear being kind of hated by their own community, or people who are just like in between with regards to their opinion. They might also feel kind of like they don't have a place in the discussion because they get attacked from both sides. So like I think moderates are probably often kind of silenced. And I guess those are also not the people you would invite to a talk show, right? It's always more entertaining to have people with relatively extreme and sordid views. So yeah, I would say we have to kind of find a way to make people with less extreme or more complicated combinations of views more visible.
Right, and it's probably the majority, right? Because we put people in these boxes, but probably most of us are some other random shape, right? I mean, most people do have some cross-cutting issues. In fact, your paper talks about that a little bit, that the issue polarization or this issue diagnosticity it's hard to find. I mean, you could find some, but I mean, there's many cases where people have issues, but they, like you say, it's not something we sort of celebrate. I think that's something we have to get better at, is sort of celebrating that idea of these cross-cutting, positions. And it's tough because, like you say, the incentives are all there to bring out the loud voices. But I think maybe we can make that message a little clearer. There's probably a lot more people like you if you hold some of those cross-cutting ideas or like you say, sort of counter stereotypical ideas. There's probably a lot more people like you, but it can be a little hard to sort of find your tribe because the loud voices that are very partisan really dominate the space.
Yeah. I mean, there's also this phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, where a group of people, they all think they share the same opinion, but actually no one, or like almost no one, really shares it. But they don't dare to speak up because there's such a strong norm of expressing certain opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you think there's any implications or how policymakers or maybe the media might be able to apply these findings?
I'm not sure. I mean, it is pretty much basic research still. So yeah, I don't know whether we can really infer any like policy recommendations from it. But I think like everyone interested in reducing this tendency to categorize should maybe just think about how they use these labels, because like often maybe when someone says something we think is kind of not a good opinion, a conservative opinion, a liberal opinion, whatever, we then try to kind of label it in order to discredit it maybe. So we say, yeah, that's a conservative idea, that's doesn't make sense, and thereby we create this kind of association between the opinion and the label, right? And I think what we should do instead in most cases is just try to explain why we disagree with the opinion and refrain from using any labels. So yeah, I think this is something that anyone could do in theory. And I don't know, like, I mean, as you said, there are strong incentives to use kind of extreme examples in media, and I don't know like whether media creators are idealistic enough to to choose something that might bring less profit.
Yeah, in media and in political campaigns. And I mean, it's sort of nice when they can create these simple views of the world, right? They can use certain language and that's all then they'll sort of, it implies all these other things right away. Yeah. So I guess I'd like to see if we could wrap up with if you're seeing any hope out there, maybe in subsequent research or in folks that have maybe responded to this paper or anything else you're seeing out there giving us some signs of hope to maybe sort of start this spiral going in the other direction. If not, we'll cut that part out.
No, no, actually, I would say what gives me a bit of hope is that there is evidence for this overestimation of our differences. So, yeah, whatever, like however bad it seems, it's probably a little bit better in reality. And also, there's a lot of there seem to be more and more people who are kind of aware about political polarization being a problem and maybe realizing that you kind of have to think about the other side and try to create some understanding and compromise to further your own political goals, because like polarization basically kind of puts a halt to progress in either direction. So yeah, that's something I think gives me a little bit of hope. And also there's a lot of research being conducted on polarization. It's a really hot topic right now, at least in social psychology or political psychology. And there's also more and more initiatives trying to tackle this issue, like your podcast even. Yeah, so I think those are some little things that give me a bit of hope.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show again, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.